Hi, friends. I have another game to share with you all today. This was a game that I played last night on stream, and it ended in a very beautiful checkmate that's definitely worth sharing, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So let's just dive right in. This game was a Gioco piano, so my opponent played an Italian. I always play bishop c5, and d6, just trying to get the bishop out, potentially pinning the knight to the queen. And my opponent immediately lashes out in the center with a gambit, playing d4. So this is a free pawn, and I decided to take with the knight initially. Knight takes, bishop takes, and he does give up a pawn in the center, but my bishop on d4 can be attacked with c3, potentially buying him tempo, perhaps. He steps the king aside with obvious intent to push this f pawn that was pinned to his king. So now he's freed up the f pawn, and I just play h6, very slow move. But basically, I want to develop the knight to f6 and not have to worry about this pin on the queen from his bishop. So I just continue on with getting the knight in, planning on castling. And here my opponent plays a very sneaky a4 move. At the moment, I just didn't really address this idea, but remember, c3 can hit the bishop. So after the bishop comes back, this a4 move threatens a5, trapping the bishop. So I didn't really address that at all. I played a little quickly, and I just castled the king side, and now my opponent plays c3. So this bishop is very close to being trapped. There is a way to get out of this. First, if I go bishop to b6, force a5, then bishop to c5. After b4, I can hit the bishop back with d5, at the same time freeing up this diagonal. I could also maybe just go here first and then this. I'm not really too sure how the line goes, but I had this idea of trying to attack this bishop back and at the same time freeing up a square for my bishop. So I developed with tempo. This is probably not a really good move, but it just simply moves the queen aside, and I still have this issue with my bishop. So I play b5, saying if you take my bishop, I'll take yours. And this is a free pawn. So I was up a pawn. I'm giving a pawn back. He takes. Now I play here, and obviously bishop to c6 will hit my rook. But a6 frees up this square from my bishop, so I'm not losing a piece. So he goes for this, obviously, and instead of saving the rook, I just save the piece because I'd rather be down in exchange than down a piece. So they take and I take, and it's true I'm down in material, but I did get their light square bishop, so I have the bishop pair. The center is pretty open, which is good, and my bishops are pointing, well, at least my queen and this bishop are pointing right at the king's side. This bishop, maybe not the best attacking piece at the moment, but it is unopposed. So I did get that light square bishop for the rook. So it's not completely lost at this point. They play h3. I just bring the bishop back. They develop a piece, and now I take on f4. So once the knight develops, notice this c3 move. It did try to trap the bishop. It blocks the knight from going to c3. So the knight has to go to d2, and now it's blocking the bishop. So at this moment, I decide to take on f4. So instead of bishop takes, rook takes, and now I bring the rook to the e file, and I just want to put some pressure on this pawn with as many pieces as possible, and that'll slow down this knight, which will slow down the bishop, which will slow down the rook. It's kind of just piling up as much as I can, pinning the pawn to the queen. Going to try to attack it as much as possible. So here my opponent plays a5, and the idea apparently behind a5 is to develop the rook this way. So it's going to take a couple moves for these pieces to get out of the way, for the rook to get into the game. So my opponent decides to go with a5 and rook a4, which is also lending some support over e4 after my last move, which is really piling on this pawn. So I developed the queen, so not the best square in the corner, and I developed with tempo on the rook. So the rook reacts also with tempo on the queen. So the knight's defending the rook, so I just step the queen back. And no longer attacking this pawn, so the queen steps up. This is actually kind of an interesting move. I'm not really sure what it's doing besides just trying to get more attackers on my king side. But this frees up the e3 square, which my bishop can make use of. And notice this knight is still blocking the bishop. So this bishop with no legal moves, not controlling e3 at all. I take advantage of this queen move, giving up e3. So I come with tempo on the rook. Rook steps back, hitting my bishop. And now I reroute the bishop here, hitting the queen. So the queen steps back. And at this moment, after the rook and the queen leave defense of the pawn, I decide now is the time to take on e4. So I'm getting another pawn, which is good. And here he takes with the knight. Now notice the bishop here is hanging, actually, and the knight is pinned to the bishop. So I had a couple of ways of taking here, and I figured in some lines I would be winning the bishop. So I decided to take with the knight because I wanted to take with the bishop hitting this rook. I didn't want to take this right away. I'm not sure why I decided to choose this line, but I did like the idea of attacking both the rook and the bishop. So that's why I took with the knight first, so I could take with the bishop second. If I take with the bishop first, hitting the rook immediately, after knight takes, I am hitting the queen, but the queen can simply just step aside and defend the bishop at the same time. So that was more of like a trade, and I'd be left with this knight on e4 when I want to maintain the bishop pair, because I like the strength of this light square bishop. So I'm not going to take with the bishop first. I'm going to preserve the bishop and take with the knight first. So trading knights, and now I have this bishop attacking the rook. I have my other bishop attacking their bishop. So my opponent decides to actually give the exchange back and take this dark square bishop. So their piece is no longer hanging, and here I obviously just take the rook, and my opponent makes this very big blunder at this moment because I actually have a really strong threat that I didn't realize was in the position until after my opponent blundered. The blunder isn't so obvious, actually. It's actually kind of a common theme where two pieces are hanging, and so my opponent decides, instead of saving their bishop and me saving my bishop, they decide to go all out and try to take a pawn and say that, my bishop is still hanging. If I take their bishop, they'll take mine. And at this moment, I was starting to look over my options. I distinctly remember I could try to retreat my bishop with an attack on their rook, but they could simply just, move the rook and attack my bishop, or even worse, they could try to threaten checkmate on my king. And so I decided, let's not try to save the bishop. Maybe I could also just take this pawn with check. But that I looked at and saw queen takes, and that's pinning my pawn to my king and also threatening mate. So definitely didn't want to do that. And then I realized I had this really beautiful move. Queen, you guys can try to figure it out on your own if you want to pause here. I kind of gave away a little hints, but yes. The move is queen takes h3, taking advantage of this temporary pin that the bishop has on the pawn. So the queen is immune, and this forces king over. And to finish off this beautiful sequence, there's rook to e1 check, and just really driving home the point that this is such a huge blunder, that I have these amazing moves. Queen takes, hanging the queen seemingly, and now definitely hanging the rook, but distracting the queen's defense over g2. So my opponent resigns here. This is their only move, or this, but no matter what they do, queen takes g2 next is just checkmate. So really awesome sequence that I was very happy to find in the game. And yeah, it took me a little bit, but I was definitely not expecting bishop takes h6, so I wasn't even thinking about taking on h3. But once the opportunity presented itself, I found it, and yeah, had to share this one with you guys. So hope you appreciated it. Hope you learned something from it. and I hope you enjoyed. So I'll see you guys next time.